Welcome to today's deep dive, where we'll be exploring the Google Ventures sprint process.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, it should be interesting. We've got some excerpts from Jake Knapp's book, Sprint, to guide us.
A classic.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And basically, we're going to break down this whole 5-day process for, kind of fast-tracking innovation
Nice.
so that you can see if it's something that you could use in your own work, see if it's a good fit.
Awesome.
What I find so interesting about the sprint process is how it actually came about, because Jake Knapp himself was getting frustrated.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was initially like super into optimizing team processes,
Okay.
particularly
Well,
brainstorming.
like the classic brainstorm, everyone gets in a room, throws out ideas.
Exactly. He was known for leading these huge brainstorming sessions.
Yeah.
But there's this great story in the book where an engineer actually challenges him.
Oh, wow.
He's like, is there any proof that this even works?
Ooh, calling him out.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And it led to this sort of epiphany for Knapp.
Like an aha moment.
Yeah, where he realized that maybe he was so focused on the process that he hadn't really looked at the outcomes.
That's so interesting because it's like he's so busy, running the machine that he never stopped to think about what it was producing.
Exactly. And when he really thought about it and examined the outcomes, he discovered that those group brainstorming sessions, they rarely produce the most successful ideas.
Interesting. So where were the good ideas coming from?
Well, often these great ideas emerged when individuals were working alone
Oh, okay.
under like a tight deadline.
Ah, that makes sense. It's like when you're under pressure and you suddenly have that like aha moment.
Exactly. And that's actually a key insight that led to the first sprint,
I see.
which was one day dedicated to sharing information and preliminary ideas, and then followed by 4 days of just intense prototyping.
Wow. So they really hit the ground running.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that this process, it wasn't some like top-down mandate or anything.
So it wasn't like a rule that everyone had to follow
No, it spread organically within Google, like from one team to another.
just because people saw it working.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It was all about effectiveness, not theory.
that's a good approach.
So then Knapp joins Google Ventures and teams up with Braden Kovitz and John Zaratsky to kind of solidify and refine this process.
A real dream team.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. And each of them brought their own strengths to the table.
I can imagine.
Like Kovitz was really into emphasizing the entire customer experience,
Yeah.
not just looking at individual pieces.
Oh, okay. So looking at the whole picture.
Yeah, and then Zaratsky, he was all about tackling the company's biggest problems head on, the ones that keep you up at night.
I can definitely relate to that.
Now, I will say, though, not everyone was immediately sold on this whole sprint idea.
Oh, really? I'm surprised.
Yeah, there's actually a quote from one designer in the book who said that initially sprints, it sounded like a bunch of BS.
Wow. So there were some skeptics.
Yeah, but on the flip side, there's also this story about a founder who became like totally hooked after their first sprint.
What changed their mind?
Well, they saw how it could deliver some pretty ambitious results in just 1 week.
Okay. So they were convinced by the results.
Exactly. So it's interesting to see that contrast.
Yeah.
Some people are skeptical, some people are immediately on board.
I guess that's how it is with anything new.
Yeah. But what I find really interesting is that the sprint process is surprisingly adaptable.
Okay. How so?
Well, Knapp and his team, they used it with a really diverse range of clients. Like they worked with high-tech companies, medic startups even helped name a company using a sprint.
Wow, that's a wide range of applications.
Right. And one of the stories I found most compelling was about Savioki.
Savioke.
Yeah, they're a robotic startup.
Yeah.
And they were about to launch a pilot program for their delivery robot.
Ooh, like a robot that delivers things.
Yeah, exactly. But they had one big question. Would guests find the robot helpful or just plain creepy?
I could see that being a concern. It's a robot delivering things to your room.
It's kind of like, is it convenient or is it weird?
Exactly. And it highlights this challenge of predicting human behavior.
Or like, how will people react to this?
Yeah, and Savioke needed answers fast.
So their sprint really focused on these key questions, like, can we make a delivery that feels easy and natural? And will guests feel uncomfortable or weird about a robot, in the hallways?
Those are definitely some important questions to answer.
And this is where one of the core principles of the sprint comes into play.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It's all about choosing the absolute most important problem to solve.
So focusing your energy.
Exactly.
Mm.
Because that sets the laser focus for the entire team.
That makes sense.
And Knapp actually uses this analogy of sprints allowing teams to time travel.
Time travel.
Yeah, it's like you get to see the finished product and how customers react to it before you invest all this time and energy and resources.
Oh, wow. That's pretty powerful.
And here's another interesting thing. Every sprint is a win, even if the prototype fails.
Wait, a failed sprint is a win? How does that work?
Well, think of it this way. If the sprint is successful, it validates your idea and you can move forward. But if it fails, it helps you identify those major flaws early on.
So either way, you're getting valuable information.
Exactly. You're either getting a green light or you're saving yourself months or even years of wasted work.
Okay, yeah, I see how that's a win-win situation. It's like, you said it's almost like time travel. You're getting a glimpse into the future and seeing how your idea will play out.
Exactly. And it kind of takes the pressure off knowing that even if it doesn't work perfectly, you're still getting something out of it.
It's like a no-lose situation.
It reminds me of the Apollo 13 mission.
Yeah.
They had a clear plan and prioritized the most critical problem to bring those astronauts home safely.
That's a great analogy. So let's talk about the structure of the sprint itself. How do these 5 days actually break down?
Okay, so Monday is all about setting the stage.
Okay.
You define the long-term goal, you figure out what the critical sprint questions are, you map out the customer journey, and you gather expert insights from within the team.
So Monday is about getting everyone on the same page and understanding the problem.
Exactly. Then Tuesday is all about inspiration and exploration.
Ooh, fun.
Yeah, the team looks at existing solutions through something called lightning demos.
What are those?
It's where they quickly showcase different approaches to the problem.
Oh, okay. So like a rapid-fire overview of different ideas.
Exactly. And then each team member sketches out their own potential solutions.
So it's back to individual work.
Yeah, no group brainstorming here.
Interesting. So how do they narrow down all those individual ideas?
That happens on Wednesday, which is decision day.
Big decisions.
The team reviews and critiques all the sketches, and then through a structured voting process, they select the best ideas to move forward with.
So Wednesday is about choosing the most promising solution.
Exactly. Then Thursday is all about building
Building what?
a realistic prototype of the chosen solution.
Oh, okay.
But the goal here isn't perfection.
Right, because you only have a day.
Yeah, it's more about creating something tangible that you can actually test with users.
So it doesn't have to be perfect, just functional.
Exactly. Knapp calls it Goldilocks quality. The prototype needs to be just real enough to elicit genuine user reactions
That makes sense.
without getting bogged down in all the details.
So you're not trying to build the entire finished product.
No, just something that represents the core functionality and user experience.
And then finally, Friday is test day.
Yes. You get real users to interact with the prototype,
Exciting.
and the team observes and gathers feedback through structured interviews.
So you're seeing how the solution works in the real world.
Exactly, and gathering those crucial insights to inform your next steps.
Okay, so Friday is all about user feedback. Now, throughout the sprint, there's also this important role called the decider, right? Can you tell me more about that?
Yes, the decider plays a crucial role throughout the entire sprint.
Okay, what do they do?
Well, they're basically the key decision maker.
So they have the final say.
Exactly. They have the authority to make the call on important matters as they come up.
So it's someone who can make those tough decisions when the team can't reach a consensus.
Right. And it's important to choose a decider who really understands the problem at hand
Okay.
and who has the authority to actually implement any decisions based on the sprint's outcomes.
So they need to have some real power.
Yeah. And they also need to be able to make those tough calls when necessary.
It sounds like a challenging role.
It can be, and that's why it's so important that everyone on the team understands and respects the decider's role from the very beginning.
I can imagine that would prevent a lot of disagreements and keep things moving smoothly.
Exactly. And there's even an example in the book of what can go wrong when the decider isn't fully present.
Oh, what happened?
There was a sprint where the decider wasn't actively involved in the process.
Oh.
And then later on, they completely overruled the team's final decision.
Oh, no, that sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, it led to a lot of wasted effort and frustration for everyone involved.
So choosing the right decider is crucial.
Absolutely. Now, another key element of the sprint process is the use of how might we notes.
How might we notes? What are those?
It's basically a technique for reframing problems as opportunities for solutions.
Okay, I'm listening.
So instead of dwelling on the negative, you rephrase the problem in a more solution-oriented way.
Okay, so can you give me an example?
Sure, imagine you're in a sprint and you've identified a problem, like doctors are hesitant to recommend our new treatment.
Okay.
Instead of just saying that, you would rephrase it as, how might we make our treatment more appealing to doctors?
Oh, I see. So you're shifting the focus from the problem to the solution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that subtle shift in language can really open up your thinking.
Okay, that makes sense. And is there a real-world example of how these how might we notes have been used?
Yeah, actually, in the Flatiron Health Sprint.
Flatiron Health?
Yeah, they're a healthcare technology company. And they were using a sprint to brainstorm ways to increase the number of cancer patients participating in clinical trials.
That's a really important challenge.
It is. And during the sprint, they use this technique to reframe those challenges into opportunities.
Okay, so like instead of saying it's hard for coordinators to find suitable trials.
Exactly. They would ask, how might we make it easier for coordinators to find suitable trials?
Okay, I see how that little tweak in language can make a big difference.
Yeah, and ultimately they decided to focus their sprint on improving the coordinator's experience during the initial patient evaluation.
So they got really specific.
Exactly, because that's when most of the trial matching happens.
I see how that would be a high impact area to focus on.
Yeah, and it all came from using those how might we notes.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about prototyping. You mentioned earlier that the goal is to create something real enough to test with users, but not get bogged down in perfection.
Right, that Goldilocks quality.
Exactly. Do you have any tips on how to achieve that balance?
Well, a good way to think about it is to remember that prototypes don't have to be perfect.
Okay.
They're more like those facades used in old Western movies.
Oh, like the fake storefronts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They create the illusion of reality without actually having to build the whole town.
All right. That's a great example.
For example, in the FitStar Sprint, they were having trouble explaining their personalized fitness app.
What was the problem?
Well, people kept thinking it was just another workout video.
Oh, I see.
And their CEO, Mike, was really determined to showcase how the app actually worked like a personal trainer in your pocket.
Okay, so they needed to find a way to demonstrate that personalization aspect.
Exactly. But they couldn't just film new videos with their celebrity trainer for their prototype.
Why not?
Well, they had time and budget constraints.
That makes sense.
So they got creative and used Keynote, the presentation software, to create a clickable prototype.
Keynote. I wouldn't have thought of that.
Pretty clever workaround.
Yeah.
And they even included mock App Store screenshots to make it feel more realistic.
Wow, so they really went the extra mile.
And this allowed them to test different ways of explaining the app's personalization features.
That's smart.
So what did they learn? Well, they found that the sections where Mike explained the program, in his own words, were really effective.
Oh, interesting. So like a personal touch.
Yeah, users immediately grasped the concept and got excited about the app. But then a later section that featured this character called Dr. Algorithm explaining the app's algorithms that fell completely flat.
Oh, no. So even small details, like the way you explain something, can have a big impact.
Exactly. And it just goes to show how beneficial it is to have that prototype, even if it's not fully functional.
It's all about testing and iterating.
And that actually brings us to another key principle of the sprint process, the focus on small data.
Small data.
Yeah, you don't actually need to test your prototype with hundreds of people.
Really? I would have thought you'd need a much larger sample size.
It might seem counterintuitive, but Knapp argues that observing just 5 carefully selected users,
5?
yeah, just 5, can be enough to uncover a wealth of insights.
That's surprising.
I know, right?
Oh?
But it's all about quality over quantity.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
By carefully observing those 5 users interacting with the prototype, you can uncover hidden usability problems and really understand why they're doing what they're doing.
So it's about getting those deep insights from a smaller group of people.
Exactly. And it kind of reminds me of how the Harry Potter books almost didn't get published.
Really? Because of small data?
In a way, the manuscript was rejected by like 8 publishers.
Wow.
It was only when a single 8-year-old girl read a sample chapter and told her dad it was the best thing ever that the 9th publisher decided to take a chance on it.
That's a great story. And a perfect example of how one data point from the right person can be so powerful.
Right. All those publishers were trying to predict what kids would like, but this little girl's genuine reaction was all the validation they needed.
It's a good reminder that sometimes we overthink things, and that getting that direct feedback, even from a small number of people, can be incredibly valuable.
Exactly. So now back to the sprint process. You've created your prototype, you've run your user test. What happens next?
That's a good question. What do you do with all that feedback?
Well, Friday's all about analyzing that feedback and making a decision based on the insights you've gathered throughout the week.
Okay.
The team looks for patterns in how users reacted to the prototype.
So, like, were there moments of delight? Points of confusion?
Exactly. And did the prototype actually answer those key sprint questions?
Right. You have to tie it back to those initial goals that you set on Monday.
Exactly. So the team has to figure out if the sprint validated their initial idea or if it revealed some fatal flaws in their thinking.
I see, so it's decision time.
And at this point, it all comes down to the decider.
The decider again.
Yep, they make the final call on the next steps.
So what are the options?
Well, maybe the prototype was a hit and the team can move forward with development.
Hmm.
Or maybe it revealed some serious problems and it's back to the drawing board.
But even a failed sprint can be a success.
Right, exactly.
Ah.
Because you're saving time and resources by catching those issues early on.
It's like making a course correction before you've gone too far down the wrong path.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most valuable aspects of the sprint process.
What is?
That it allows you to fail fast and learn quickly.
That's a great way to put it.
You're not wasting months or even years building something that nobody wants.
So sprints can be really useful for all sorts of teams and projects, but I'm curious, can any problem be tackled with a sprint?
That's a great question. And while sprints are incredibly versatile, there are some things to consider when deciding if a sprint is the right tool for the job.
Okay, like what?
First, you need a problem that's important enough to dedicate an entire week to.
So it has to be a high priority problem.
Yeah, you're basically putting everything else on hold to focus on this one challenge.
Okay, I see.
And the problem should be something that can actually be addressed through prototyping and user testing.
Right, so if the solution is purely conceptual or needs a lot of research, that can't be done in a week.
Exactly. It might not be a good fit for a sprint.
That makes sense.
And sometimes the biggest hurdle is figuring out how to actually create that realistic prototype.
Right, especially for complex products or services.
Like, how do you prototype a self-driving car in a day?
That's a good question.
Well, that's where the facade mentality comes in again.
Yeah.
You don't need to build a fully functional self-driving car. You can create a simulated experience using video footage and interactive elements.
Oh, okay, so you're focusing on specific aspects of the user experience.
Exactly. You might test how the car behaves in certain situations or how the user interacts with the interface.
So it's about creating that illusion of reality without getting bogged down in the technical details.
Exactly. And that's what Thursday of the Sprint is all about, finding creative ways to prototype the solution.
Mm.
You might have to think outside the box and use some unconventional tools.
It sounds like a lot of fun, actually.
It can be. So we've talked about the structure and the principles of the sprint, but what about the people? Who makes a good sprint team?
Well, the ideal sprint team is small, usually around 7 people. And it should be diverse in terms of skills and perspectives.
So you want people from different departments.
Exactly, like design, engineering, marketing, customer service, even someone from finance.
That makes sense. You get a more holistic view of the problem that way.
And it's also crucial to have a strong facilitator.
Someone to guide the process.
Exactly, someone who can manage time effectively, encourage participation, and make sure everyone feels heard.
That's important.
And of course, it takes a certain level of trust and open-mindedness from everyone on the team.
Right, because you're asking people to step outside their comfort zones and embrace new ideas.
And that's what makes the sprint process so powerful. It combines a structured process with individual ingenuity, which can lead to some incredible breakthroughs.
It sounds like a really dynamic way of working. So let's say someone's listening to this and they're totally convinced that they want to try a sprint. What are some practical tips for getting started?
Well, first things first, choose your problem wisely.
Okay.
Make sure it's something that's truly important and aligns with your overall business goals.
Right. It should be something meaningful.
Exactly. You don't want to just pick a random challenge for the sake of having a sprint.
Then what?
Well, then assemble your dream team. Those key individuals who can bring diverse perspectives and expertise to the table.
Get the right people in the room.
And once you have your team, make sure to block off those 5 days on everyone's calendar.
So no distractions.
No distractions, no meetings, just pure, focused sprint time.
And lastly,
don't be afraid to experiment.
I love that. Don't be afraid to experiment.
The sprint process is adaptable. You can tailor it to fit your specific needs and context. You don't have to follow every step rigidly.
So it's more like a set of guidelines than a strict rule book.
Exactly. Think of it like a recipe you can add your own spice and flavor to make it your own.
So you've run your sprint, you've got your results. What happens next? How do you make sure those insights actually lead to real-world change?
Well, that's where the post-sprint process is crucial.
What do you mean?
It's not enough to just have a great prototype and some interesting user feedback.
So what do you do?
You need to translate those learnings into actionable steps.
Make it real.
Exactly. It's about bridging the gap between the sprint and the real world.
That makes sense. So how do you go about doing that?
Good documentation is key.
Okay.
During the sprint, you've generated a wealth of information.
Like what?
Notes from expert interviews, sketches, prototype iterations, user observations, and of course, those key patterns and insights from the Friday testing.
Right.
It's really important to capture all of that in a way that's easily accessible and understandable.
So you don't lose those valuable insights.
Exactly. And then it's about prioritizing those insights and deciding what to focus on first.
So,
Maybe it's refining certain aspects of the prototype, conducting further user research, or even starting to build a more robust version of the solution. It's about taking that initial spark from the sprint and fanning it into a flame.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And it probably involves communicating those insights to people outside the sprint team, right?
Absolutely. You need to get buy-in and support from the wider organization.
So that everyone's on board.
Exactly. And that helps create a culture of innovation where the learnings from the sprint can inform and inspire future projects.
That's a great point. And it's important to remember that the sprint is a cyclical process, right? It's not a one-time event.
Exactly. You can revisit the sprint methodology whenever you're facing a major challenge or need a fresh perspective.
So it's like a tool in your innovation toolkit that you can pull out whenever you need a boost.
Exactly. And as you run more sprints, you'll refine your process and develop your own best practices. You'll start to see patterns in how your team works best and what types of challenges are best suited for the sprint format. It's an ongoing learning experience.
That's great advice. So to recap, we've explored the origins of the Google Ventures, sprint its core principles, the structure of the 5-day process, and even some practical tips for implementing it.
We also looked at some real-world examples like the FitStar and Flatiron Health sprints to see how this process can be applied to different types of challenges.
Before we wrap up, is there one key takeaway you'd like our listeners to remember from this deep dive?
If there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this, it's that the sprint process is a powerful tool for anyone who wants to make faster progress on their most important work. It's not just for tech companies or startups. It can be used by teams in any industry of any size to tackle a wide range of challenges.
It's about embracing a new way of working, one that's focused, collaborative, and driven by user feedback.
And it's about having the courage to try something new, to step outside your comfort zone and experiment with a process that can help you unlock your team's creative potential and achieve breakthrough results.
And even if your sprint doesn't result in the perfect solution, you've still learned something valuable. You've gained insights, tested assumptions, and built momentum for future innovation.
Exactly. And who knows, you might even have some fun along the way.
This has been an awesome deep dive into the Google Ventures sprint process. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep sprinting towards those breakthrough ideas. So the decider is someone who can make those tough decisions when the team can't reach a consensus.
Yeah, and it's super important to choose a decider who really understands the problem
Right.
and has the authority to actually implement any decisions that come out of the sprint.
Makes sense. They got to have the power to make things happen.
And they also need to be able to make those tough calls.
It sounds like a pretty demanding role.
Yeah, it can be. That's why it's so important that everyone on the team understands and respects the decider's role from the get-go.
Yeah, I can see how that would help avoid conflict and keep things moving forward.
Exactly. And Knap actually shares an example of what can happen when the decider isn't fully on board.
Oh, what happened?
Well, there was this one sprint where the decider wasn't really involved in the day-to-day,
Uh-oh.
and then they ended up completely overruling the team's final decision.
That's gotta be frustrating.
Oh, yeah. It was a total mess. Yeah, it led to a ton of wasted effort and frustration for everyone involved.
So yeah, picking the right decider is crucial.
Absolutely. Now, another interesting element of the sprint process is the use of how might we notes.
How might we notes? What are those?
Well, it's a technique for reframing problems as opportunities for solutions.
Okay. I like where this is going.
Instead of focusing on the negative, you basically rephrase the problem in a more solution-oriented way.
Okay, so can you give me an example?
Yeah. So let's say you're in a sprint and you've identified a problem like doctors are hesitant to recommend our new treatment.
Okay. Pretty common problem, I imagine.
Yeah. And instead of just saying that, you'd rephrase it as, how might we make our treatment more appealing to doctors?
Ah, I see. So you're kind of shifting the focus from the problem to the solution.
Exactly. And that subtle shift in language can really help to unlock new ideas.
Interesting. So are there any real-world examples of how these how might we notes have been used?
Yeah, actually, in the Flatiron Health sprint, they used them extensively.
Flatiron Health.
They're a healthcare technology company. And they were using a sprint to try to figure out how to increase the number of cancer patients who participate in clinical trials.
That's a huge challenge.
It is. And during the sprint, they use this technique to reframe those challenges into opportunities.
I'm following you.
So instead of saying something like, it's hard for coordinators to find suitable trials,
Right.
they'd ask, how might we make it easier for coordinators to find suitable trials?
Okay, I see the difference. It's subtle, but it changes the whole mindset.
Exactly. And it helped them generate a ton of creative ideas.
That's awesome.
And ultimately, they decided to focus their sprint on improving the coordinator's experience during the initial patient evaluation.
Because that's when most of the trial matching happens.
Right. So they zeroed in on a really specific, high-impact area.
Love it. Okay, so now let's talk about prototyping. We talked before about how the goal is to create something real enough to test, but without getting bogged down in perfection.
Right, that whole Goldilocks quality thing.
Yeah, exactly. Do you have any tips for finding that balance?
Well, one way to think about it is that prototypes don't have to be perfect.
Okay, that's a good starting point.
Think of them more like those facades you see in old Western movies.
Oh, like those fake building fronts.
Exactly. They create the illusion of reality without actually having to build the entire town.
Right, that's a great analogy.
And in the FitStar sprint, they actually ran into this problem where they were having a hard time explaining their personalized fitness app.
What was the issue?
Well, people kept thinking it was just another workout video.
Okay, I can see how that would be a problem.
And their CEO, Mike, was really committed to showing how the app actually worked, like a personal trainer, in your pocket.
Makes sense. But how do you prototype that?
Well, they couldn't just film a bunch of new videos with their celebrity trainer for the prototype.
Why not?
Budget and time constraints.
Yeah, of course.
So they got creative and ended up using Keynote, the presentation software, to create a clickable prototype.
Really? Keynote.
Yeah. They basically hacked it to simulate the app experience, and they even included mock app score screenshots to make it feel more realistic.
That's really clever. I never would have thought of that.
So this prototype let them test different ways of explaining the app's personalization features.
I bet they learned a lot from that.
Oh, yeah. They found that the sections where Mike explained the program in his own words were super effective.
Oh, interesting. So it was like a personal touch.
Exactly. Users understood it right away and got really excited. But then a later section that featured this character called Dr. Algorithm to explain the app's algorithms, that totally bombed.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it turns out people didn't really care about the technical details. They just wanted to know how the app would help them.
So the way you explain things really matters.
Huge difference. And it
Yeah.
shows how valuable it is to have a prototype, even if it's not the real deal.
Totally. And that reminds me of something we talked about earlier, the importance of small data.
Right. You don't need to test your prototype with hundreds of people to get valuable insights.
I'm still wrapping my head around that. Just 5 users.
5 carefully selected users can be enough to uncover a gold mine of information.
It's like finding a needle in a haystack, but with way fewer haystacks to search through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes me think of how the Harry Potter books almost didn't get published.
Wait, what? Harry Potter?
Yeah, the manuscript was rejected by like 8 publishers.
No way.
It's true. It was only when a single 8-year-old girl read a sample chapter and told her dad it was the best thing ever that the publisher finally decided to take a chance on it.
Wow. So one little girl saved Harry Potter.
Basically, all those publishers were trying to guess what kids would like, but this one girl's genuine reaction was all the validation they needed.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder to listen to those individual voices, even if they seem small.
So back to the sprint. You've built your prototype, you've run your tests. What happens next?
Yeah. What do you do with all that feedback?
Well, Friday is all about analyzing that feedback and making a decision.
Based on everything you've learned throughout the week.
Exactly. The team gets together and they look for patterns in how users reacted to the prototype.
Okay.
Like, were there any moments of delight, any points of confusion? Did the prototype answer those key spring questions? It's all about connecting the dots.
Right. So you're trying to figure out if the sprint actually achieved its goals.
And this is where the decider comes back into play.
Again.
They make the final call on what to do next.
So what are the possibilities?
Well, if the prototype was a hit, the team might decide to move forward with development.
That makes sense.
But if it revealed some serious problems, then it might be back to the drawing board.
Okay, so even a failed sprint can be valuable.
For sure, because you're catching those issues early on and saving yourself a ton of time and resources down the line.
It's like a course correction, you know? You're pivoting based on real user feedback.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of the sprint process. It lets you fail fast and learn quickly.
You're not wasting years building something that nobody wants.
Exactly. So while sprints can be really helpful for a wide range of teams and projects, I'm curious, can any problem be tackled with a sprint?
That's a great question. And while sprints are pretty adaptable, there are some things to consider before diving in.
Like what? First, you need a problem that's important enough to dedicate an entire week to,
So it can't be just any problem.
right? It needs to be something that's really worth focusing on for 5 days.
Makes sense.
And it should be something that can be addressed through prototyping and user testing.
Okay.
So if the solution is something really conceptual or requires a lot of research that can't be done in a week, it might not be a good fit for a sprint.
That makes sense. You need to be able to actually build something and test it with users.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes the biggest challenge is figuring out how to create a realistic prototype.
Especially for complex products or services.
Like, how do you prototype a self-driving car in just one day?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Well, that's where the facade mentality comes back in again.
Oh, right. Like those fake building fronts.
You don't need to build the entire thing. You can just focus on specific aspects of the user experience.
Okay, so maybe you create a simulation of how the car would behave in certain situations or how the user interacts with the interface.
Exactly. And that's what Thursday of the Sprint is all about, finding creative ways to prototype the solution.
Sounds fun. But you might need to get pretty resourceful and use some unconventional tools.
Absolutely. So we've talked about the structure and the principles, but what about the people? Who makes for a good sprint team?
Ideally, a sprint team is pretty small, around 7 people.
Okay.
And it should be diverse. You want people with different skills and perspectives.
So you want people from different departments.
Exactly. Design, engineering, marketing, customer service, even someone from finance can be helpful.
So you get a really well-rounded view of the problem.
And it's super important to have a strong facilitator to guide the process.
Someone to keep things on track.
Exactly. Someone who can manage time well, encourage participation, and make sure everyone feels heard.
That's important.
And of course, the team needs to have a good amount of trust and open-mindedness.
You're asking them to step outside their comfort zones and try something new.
And that's what makes the sprint process so powerful, that combination of a structured process with individual creativity and ingenuity can lead to some pretty incredible breakthroughs.
So let's say someone's listening to this and they're thinking, I want to try a sprint. What are some practical tips for getting started?
Well, first of all, choose your problem wisely. Make sure it's something that's really important and aligns with your overall goals.
Right. It has to be something meaningful.
Exactly. You don't want to just do a sprint for the sake of doing a sprint.
So pick a problem that's worth solving.
Then you need to put together your dream team, the key players who can bring those diverse perspectives and expertise.
Makes sense. The right people in the room.
Once you have your team, make sure to block off those 5 days on everyone's calendar.
No distractions.
None. It's sprint time.
And last but not least,
Don't be afraid to experiment.
I love that. It's all about embracing the unknown.
The sprint process is adaptable. You can tweak it to fit your needs and context.
You don't have to follow it rigidly.
Exactly. It's a recipe, but you can add your own spice.
Okay, so you've run your sprint, you've got your results, now what? How do you take those insights and make sure they actually lead to real change?
Well, that's where the post-sprint process is key.
What do you mean?
It's not enough to just have a cool prototype and some interesting feedback.
So what's the missing piece?
You got to translate those learnings into action.
Make it real.
Right, bridge the gap between the sprint and the real world.
How do you do that?
Good documentation is essential.
Okay.
You've gathered so much information during the sprint notes from interviews, sketches, prototype iterations, user observations, and of course those key patterns from the Friday testing.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is, so you need to capture it all in a way that's easy to understand and access.
Otherwise, those insights could get lost.
Exactly. And then it's time to prioritize, figure out what to focus on first.
Okay.
Maybe you need to refine the prototype or do some more user research, or maybe you can start building a more robust version of the solution. It's about taking that spark from the sprint and turning it into a fire.
I like that. And you probably need to share those insights with people outside the sprint team too, right?
Absolutely. Get the wider organization on board.
Create some buy-in.
And help to foster a culture of innovation where the learnings from the sprint can inform future projects.
And it's important to remember that the sprint is cyclical, right? It's not a one-time thing.
Exactly. You can use it again and again whenever you need to tackle a big challenge or get a fresh perspective.
It's like a secret weapon in your innovation arsenal.
And as you run more sprints, you'll get better at it, refine your process, and develop your own best practices.
You'll learn what works best for your team and your specific challenges.
It's a journey of continuous improvement.
Exactly.
It's a journey of continuous improvement.
It sounds like it. And to recap, We've explored the origins of the Google Ventures sprint, the core principles, the structure of that 5-day process, and even some practical tips for putting it into practice.
We also looked at some real-world examples like those sprints at Fitstar and Flatiron Health, to see how the process can be applied to all kinds of challenges.
Exactly. Before we wrap up, is there one key takeaway you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, if there's one thing I hope folks take away, it's that the sprint process is a really powerful tool. For anyone who wants to make faster progress on their most important work.
For sure.
And it's not just for tech companies or startups.
Right, it's for everyone.
It can be used by teams in any industry of any size, to tackle all sorts of challenges.
So it's really about embracing a new way of working.
Exactly. One that's focused and collaborative and driven by user feedback.
And it's about having the courage to try something new.
Right, to step outside that comfort zone and experiment with a process that can help you unlock your team's creative potential and achieve those breakthrough results.
And even if your sprint doesn't result in the perfect solution, you've still learned something valuable.
Exactly. You've gained insights, tested assumptions, and built momentum for future innovation.
And who knows? You might even have some fun along the way.
That's the most important part.
This has been a fantastic deep dive into the Google Ventures sprint process.
It really has.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep sprinting.